Hello and welcome to this Victorian election special on ABC News. I'm Patricia Carvelis. It's great to have your company tonight. After weeks of negative campaigning, controversy and record numbers of people voting early, tomorrow is election day in Victoria. So can Daniel Andrews deliver a historic third term for Labor, or will he be plunged into minority government? Either way, repairing Victoria's economy will need to be a priority. The state is on track to carry more debt than the other eastern states combined. This election campaign has been a spending race, yet both major parties are spruiking their economic credentials. Danny Morgan and Christian Silva have taken a closer look at the shape of Victoria's economy.
For Victorians, the past 2.5 years have been a white-knuckle ride. COVID-19 sent the economy into freefall, and the cycle of lockdowns provided shocks that will take years to overcome.
Thankfully, there are signs this crazy ride is slowing down. But what sort of shape is the economy in, and what can politicians do to help it bounce back?
The good news is, despite concerns about inflation and rising interest rates, the latest national accounts show Victorians are spending again on dining out, grabbing a drink and having some fun.
It's just glorious to see people out and about and having fun. We've had incredibly busy sellout days, well up with 2019 pre-COVID figures.
Stronger consumer spending, along with dizzying amounts of government funding for health and transport infrastructure, are keeping the economy moving forward. The problem is that public investment is leaving the state with a skyrocketing debt, predicted to climb from $73 billion to more than $165 billion by 2026.
I'm not really worried about that because at the moment the big issue is inflation. Believe it or not, when inflation goes as it does, the economy grows, and as it grows, the real value of the debt shrinks.
But in the long term, the state will need a strong private sector to help pay that debt back. And the national accounts show private sector investment actually fell in the last quarter. A weakening global economy and supply shortages are playing a part, but there's another glaring problem facing Victorian businesses.
The big issue for the economy right now is the shortage of workers. You can see signs up, vacancies, please apply.
And that's what makes this election unusual. Often there's pressure on governments to create jobs. This time, the challenge is to find workers to fill a huge number of vacancies across the economy.
Workers like Yanti Hartshorn could be part of the solution. She used to have a job in hospitality.
Hello, Michael, how are you?
But Yanti wanted better job security and new skills. So 6 months ago, she switched to at-home aged care.
It's not a job for everyone because it is a hard industry. You just have to know how to listen and be really open-minded.
Victoria needs around 370,000 new workers in the next 3 years. The industry with the biggest shortage is aged and disability care, where 15,000 employees are required. Both major parties have promised to pay for nurses and midwives to complete qualifications. The aged care sector wants similar support.
That would be face-to-face training in developing the skills of those people who traditionally haven't considered themselves to be care workers.
Along with aged care, some of the other industries in Victoria with major workforce shortages include nursing, software development and retail.
There is a bit of a gap in terms of where our training is in Australia. And for us, it's not just about getting bodies on the ground, it's about matching the skills that businesses need with the skills that Australian residents and incoming residents have.
There will be more of those incoming residents under federal plans to bolster skilled migration, but that's unlikely to address short-term gaps.
Well, let's get the latest from the set of the ABC's Victoria Votes coverage with host David Spears and election analyst Anthony Green.
Well, PK, this is the ABC Election Centre, where tomorrow night you'll be able to watch all the action unfold as the results come in. Campaigning, of course, is all but over now, but tomorrow night it's a very big and very busy night for one man in particular, and that is, of course, the ABC's one and only election analyst Anthony Green. We've pulled him away from his preparations, crunching all the data. Anthony, well, we can see the chamber from the last election 4 years ago, and you can really see there how dominant Labor's win was. What are you going to be looking for tomorrow night?
Well, Labor can lose 11 seats and still hold on to the majority government. But they've got three problems. One is inner city seats. The Liberals are directing preferences to the Greens ahead of Labor at this election for the first time in more than a decade, and that could cost Labor a couple of inner city seats. There are seats in the outer west of Melbourne where there are independents challenging in traditionally safe Labor seats, which they could be losing seats. And there's quite a range of outer suburban marginal seats where the coalition, the Liberal Party in particular, could pick up seats. It's not enough, I think, to get the coalition to government, but there's enough seats there to force Labor into minority.
There's a big early vote as well, a lot of pre-polls in this election. Does that mean we're in for a bit of a late night with the count tomorrow night?
This is actually one of the harder elections I've ever worked on, I must say. One is the enormous pre-poll on post vote, more than the federal election. And the way it's counted in Victoria, it's going to take a long time before we can make proper use of it because we don't know where the votes are from. They just come in as progressive totals. And the other issue is the number of candidates. There's 14 and 15 candidates in some seats. They'll get the first preference count in, but the poor old scrutineer, counters are trying to find where the preference goes when you've got 15 candidates on the ballot paper. It's not very easy.
It's going to keep you on your toes. Anthony, thank you. Good luck tomorrow night. Please get some sleep. Before then, PK, we'll throw it back to you. Don't forget to join us, 6 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time from the ABC Election Centre for all the results in Victoria Votes.
Thanks, David. Cannot wait. I'm joined now in the studio by Kos Samaras, who is the Director of Strategy and Campaigns of independent polling and research company Redbridge, and Tony Barry, who's also at Redbridge. Welcome to both of you again. OK, Kos, it's election eve. You've looked at all of the tracking polling, you've looked at all of the numbers. Labor has to lose 11 seats to be in trouble. Are they going to lose those seats?
There's still a possibility they can actually lose in excess of 11 seats, even if the 2PP is quite healthy for them tomorrow, because the result is going to be quite patchy. So we could see swings in excess of 10% in some seats and swings in the other direction in other seats. And so it's still possible. But when I say they're going to lose in excess of 11 seats, it could be to the Liberal Party, but not entirely to the Liberal Party. OK, so 1999. A year I remember, not just because of the Prince song, but for other reasons too. Jeff Kennett lost an election he didn't expect to lose. We keep hearing comparisons to the Jeff Kennett election, which he didn't quite see coming. Do you think there are parallels?
No. There are similarities that gives us hope. And certainly there was a move for change that was perhaps not picked up. I think the similarities in that whole campaign was structured around Jeff Kennett. This whole campaign has been structured around Daniel Andrews, which is a mistake. And I think now that he's losing a bit of altitude, there's probably a few regrets internally about the focus of all being on him. But I think that's about where the similarities will end.
What do you think about those parallels? I asked Steve Bracks about it this morning on Radio National Breakfast, and he said, he thinks there are actually key differences, including the fact that the Liberals are not in good shape.
I would say there's a more significant difference, and that is a demographic one. So right now, millennials, for example, people, that is voters under the age of 40, make up 38% of the voters roll in just the city of Greater Melbourne, and they are the biggest voting cohort in Melbourne. Now, when you look at the Resolve poll that was published this week, the 2PP vote for voters under the age of 35 for Labor was 67. And the 2PP vote for Labor for voters over the age of 55 was 44. So we think that millennials tomorrow will save Daniel Andrews' bacon.
Whoa.
Yep.
So you think the millennials
Yep.
will save Labor's bacon?
Absolutely.
And what, have they not been pre-polling at the same level?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's right. We do find that they tend to vote much later, and particularly on the day. So we'll find that tomorrow that the 2PP vote for Labor will be much higher than pre-poll.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's talk about the pressure Labor's facing on the left from the Greens. What do you think is going to transpire there? Will they lose the seat of Richmond, for instance?
That's a good point. We go back to millennials. In those seats, millennials are a problem for Labor because they overwhelmingly lean towards the Greens. And I think at this stage, Labor is in danger of losing up to 4 seats to the Greens.
Up to 4? Which ones?
So it's Richmond, Northcote, and then we are looking at Albert Park and Footscray. Albert Park and Footscray are different to Richmond and Northcote because the Greens need to jump over the Liberal Party to run second, and then the Liberal Party preferences to elect them. That dynamic needs to occur tomorrow night. If it doesn't, then Labor's fine. In the other 2 seats, which is Richmond and Northcote, all the Greens need to do is finish ahead of them in a primary vote. I think
that's because of the way the Liberals have also preference.
That's right.
And that's been very controversial, of course. Liberals didn't used to preference the Greens ahead of Labor, but obviously this campaign is quite different. It's been a pretty nasty campaign in the last week. And there's also been a few problems, I think, for the Liberals. I mean, they couldn't even quantify their election spending. Has that kind of made people worry about parking their vote with the Liberals in the final days?
Well, I don't think either side really, their economic costings was pretty thin. The Liberals did rely on the Parliamentary Budget Office, which I thought was very smart politics. Hard to argue against a body set up by the Labor government. But in terms of the preferences, I think the preference strategy is going to be critically important. The minor and independent vote will probably be mid-20s, perhaps higher. So where those preferences fall is going to be critically important. That's why we're going to see, some very odd results. And I think the Liberal strategy of put Labor last has been simple. I'm not a fan of putting Greens above Labor, but I do like it tactically. And I think tactically it's been a very smart move.
What do you think?
I agree with Tony. So where I think the Liberal strategy is focused on is on the group of Victorians who are voting for other minor parties. And for all the published polls that we've seen to date, that is a very significant number of Victorians. It will be the biggest, I think, in Victorian history since the Second World War. And the trick here is, can the Liberal Party convince those voters that when they are preferencing through to put Labor last and Liberals obviously ahead of them? If that happens, that could mean the difference between 5 or 6 additional seats. So again, we'll go back to that 2PP is almost irrelevant in these sort of contests because you can extrapolate the 2PP in a calculation in a poll, that's fine, but if the Liberal strategy actually works, it upends it and then falls, knocks over another 5 seats.
Okay, so is it possible for our viewers who are tuning in and aren't across all of the detail, for the Liberals to find a pathway tomorrow to majority?
Highly unlikely.
You can't see it?
I can't see it.
They need a swing of in excess of 10% right across the state of Victoria, and they need to convince a cohort, I'll go back to millennials again, to do something which they've not done in any Western country to date, and that is vote for Conservatives.
So the Conservative brand is not popular with millennials. That's a structural issue, isn't it, for the Conservative side of politics?
Yeah, and look, COS has extrapolated some data on that. I think you go back 10 years, 2012, the electoral roll in Victoria, millennials made up 18% of the electoral roll. They now make up 36% of the electoral roll.
Which is huge.
Yeah, it's huge. So, and what we're also finding is the millennial vote, they use their vote tactically. So it's not just a matter of who they want to see in government, it's how they send a message and send a message to, say, the Liberal Party, which we saw in Kooyong and Goldstein, and particularly in seats like Hawthorn, which is a very young profile. So the tactical voting combined with the size is upending the dynamics, and it's a structural problem in the Liberal Party's vote.
Incredible. So how big could the crossbench end up being if the bacon is not saved by millennials and Daniel Andrews has to govern in minority?
So, double digits without question. And it'll be a mixture of Greens, possibly some Teals, outer suburban, Western outer suburban independents who would more normally side with the Conservative side of politics, country independents. We have a number of contests out there right now where I think the independents are well placed to actually either defend their seats that they've got, which is 12 of them at the moment, and those who are obviously challenging secure those seats. So it could be a very big crossbench.
It sounds like it's going to be quite huge. Well, you're both part of the ABC's election coverage, of course. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. One more sleep.
Thank you, Speaker.
Cos Samaras and Tony Barry there. Well, the contest has been narrowing in Melbourne's inner city, as we were saying, where the Greens will be hoping to gain ground. Reporter Margaret Paul has been speaking to voters in the Labor-held seat of Richmond.
We are in inner Melbourne, in the seat of Richmond. Think suburbs like Fitzroy, Collingwood, Clifton Hill and, of course, Richmond. Now, this area has been Labor held since 1908, but the Greens have been coming for Labor over the past few elections, and they think with the retiring sitting MP, they might have a crack this time. Both sides are putting lots of resources into this seat. Let's go and chat to some voters. Just wondering if you know who this is.
Dan Andrews.
Okay. Dan Andrews. And do you know who that is?
Nope. No.
Andrew?
Yeah, Daniel Andrews. Do you know who this guy is?
I'm not sure this one.
Just wondering if you know who that is.
Dan Andrews.
Yep. And do you know who that is?
Unfortunately, yeah. Mr. Guy.
I just saw an ad down there, the Greens member must be for
Yep.
Yep.
Gabrielle de Vietri, the Greens candidate for Richmond. How about this?
No.
That's the Labor candidate, Lauren O'Dwyer.
Right, yeah.
So what are the kinds of issues that you think are going to be important?
Cost of living is probably the biggest one for me, I think.
Climate change is a huge one.
We're in the healthcare industry, so we see a lot in terms of what the government's going to do for healthcare, how it affects our particular industry. I think is probably a main thing.
Bit of a firm Green voter. Because of their policies regarding climate change, regarding social values.
And what do you think of those two men?
I'm quite happy for Dan Andrews to keep on going.
Traditionally been Labor voters, mainly because they seem to, and I think during COVID times they've had things quite tough. But I think they did relatively well, all things considered.
Yeah, I'll be voting Greens.
Okay, and why is that?
Because they support
their policies.
Yeah, environmental policies. They've got the future of Australia in mind.
I would probably vote for the current Premier, to be honest.
Why is that?
I just like him. I know he's controversial and I know COVID, interesting, but I kind of feel like he's a bit of a safe pair of hands.
The way that Daniel Andrews handled the pandemic is a good thing.
Yeah, he's a good man before, and that's why.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're happy.
Thank you.
Thanks for chatting.
Bye.
I'm glad she's happy too. Joining me now is Annika Smethurst, the state political editor for The Age, and Richard Willingham, the ABC's state political editor. Welcome to both of you. And Annika, beginning with you, you have written a column which I've read carefully, predicting all sorts of wild things in this election. We just heard from Cos and Tony that they think the millennials are coming out really to save Dan Andrews' bacon. Is it going to be that simple?
I don't know if it's that simple, but I do agree that whilst Labor are the ones in trouble, I think, there's definitely the only certainty, I guess, of tomorrow, I think, is that Labor will lose seats. It's how many the coalition can win and what the independents do. And whilst the coalition seem to be surging home in terms of their primary, some track polling actually has them not only equal but ahead in some seats. They don't benefit that much from preferences. And I think when you do look at the demographics, it's a very different scenario from when we look at the Kennett election in '99 or the 2010 election with Brumby, which are often the comparisons made about unexpected results, big swings. Victoria back then was a very different place. And I think in terms of what Cos and Tony said there, I think that's definitely the case, that when you've got that much of the population in that sort of millennial, in their 30s, professional women, we know are big influencers now, that's a different dynamic to what we saw last time.
So essentially they're more left-leaning, but we know that Daniel Andrews is a polarising figure in this election campaign. Some people love him, some people hate him. The Liberals have tried to make it a referendum on Daniel Andrews. Has that worked in their favour?
I think it has, and you see the fact that we're all talking about Labor's going to have a drop in their vote. And I think that goes back to the Premier. And I think what the Liberals are banking on, the big danger for Labor tomorrow, is all these people who aren't engaged in politics like we are, people who have gone, I need to vote. And so they're turning up this week, they're going to turn up tomorrow, and they get into the ballot box, and the only recall they have of state politics, they go, state politics, what's that? Oh yeah, Daniel Andrews, he was the Premier during lockdown. And for some people that'll be like, great, I was happy with how they handled that. It was tough, but they looked after us. For others, it's going to be that sort of visceral hatred. And I think that's the danger. That's sort of the unknown known, if you like. what do people who have very little engagement think when they recall one thing about state politics, and it's the Premier? And if that's their only thing, that's the danger for Labor.
It's been a really nasty campaign, Annika. Is that your assessment too? I mean, I've watched the last week particularly unfold, and I am struck by the level of nastiness and the petty controversies being covered continuously.
Yeah, I was having this conversation today with someone who works in one of the camps, and they were saying that, you know, it's everyone's fault. This is somebody that, you know, works in politics and said both sides have, I guess, landed some low blows. And it almost gives the right, once one side starts doing it, the other side sort of come to meet them. There's been some questionable, I guess, media coverage. You know, as an industry, I think we have to sort of look at how we cover things. Some of the criticisms, the personal attacks going after, instead of policy, I guess, chasing individual candidates, their views, trying to frame them in certain ways. You know, while some of this has merit, I guess, as a reporting style, it also just brings in quite a nasty tone. And I also think there's that underlining, as Rich just said, that underlining, you know, emotive feeling of COVID. This is very different to a lot of elections when we're sort of fighting on more of policy ground. People feel this really deeply. And we've seen that come out in polling booths. You know, there's been people injured, a lot of abuse, things like this, more than I've ever seen in covering politics.
Yeah, Rich, I think that's absolutely the case. And you can just see it in how many people are standing.
Yeah.
It's really politicised people, this pandemic, and you've got people who are really wanting to have a stake in all of this. How do you think the main parties have handled that level of controversy? Because I feel like they have been a little unprepared for just how intense it's got.
I think that's right. I think they've been unprepared for just what's happening on the booths with some of these minor parties, these sort of so-called freedom parties, because some of the vitriol is pretty awful, and we've had instances of, you know, alleged punch-ups. There've actually been some polling booths where the VEC said, okay, sorry guys, your behaviour is out of line. No one can hand out within 100 metres here. And it takes a lot of power away from people trying to get elected. That's because the behaviour, the language, I think, as Annika pointed out, some of the, you know, the media has fueled this over, and not just in the last 3 weeks, over a long period of time. People are angry, people's experiences of COVID are different. But I also think the parties have played into this. They have been willing to fight dirty. I mean, it's no surprise that in election people fight dirty, but it's a sort of a different level of nastiness. There's been some criticisms from Labor to the opposition that they've cozied up a little bit too much to some of the people who are really anti-vaccination, some of the conspiracy theories, and you get into this whole debate about, we saw lots of protests in Melbourne about the pandemic, some of the bigger ones, some of the smaller ones, some of them were quite violent. There were people that went to those protests who were completely peaceful, and others who were, you know, right tied into these sort of conspiracy theories. And has the opposition, you know, walked that line properly, it's given ammunition to the government. And got to remember, some people, including the Premier, have had death threats against them.
It's really serious stuff.
This is, you know, I mean, he uses the words the Americanisation of politics. It's just this level of nastiness now, and it's both ways. You know, Labor's willing to fight dirty as well. So I think you'd hoping tomorrow night when we get a result that maybe it is a line in the sand.
Yeah. So before we end the show, Annika, if the Premier loses ground, and inevitably he will, right? Steve Bracks conceded that. Of course, there's going to be a recalibration, a rebalancing. If he's forced into minority government, what happens? Does that really affect his ability to continue being Premier, do you think?
I think he's best placed to hold on, but I do think it'll affect his authority within the party. Parties like you to think that it's all rosy and that everybody gets along within political parties. It's not true. He's, of course, from the left. For a long time, the right, which is split here in Victoria, they've wanted it back. They want, you know, to at some point have somebody from their side become the Premier. This may fuel those sort of talks. It depends, of course, how big the split is. It also, too, Rich and I were talking, we were here last time there was a minority government in the Napthine Valley years. It can be quite chaotic. Now, I'm not saying that of all minority or hung parliaments, but it can be. And with the right opposition leader, in fact, it could almost suit someone like Matthew Guy. I don't know if he'd be able to hold on for that third term, but if that's your skill set, it can be really advantageous for if you just miss out. It'll be a very different sort of parliament going in next time if the coalition fall just short and if the Labor do fall into minority.
And if it's a green slide, like they would like it to be, and if you look at some of the moves in the inner city, could be.
It looks that way.
Will Daniel Andrews be able to govern with the Greens? He'll need their support.
Well, I think this is the really interesting thing. He's been asked nearly every day on the campaign trails, no deals will be done, no deals have been offered. You'd imagine the Greens have made it quite clear. They've almost played their cards too early by saying this is what we'll do and we'll side with Labor. So Labor's going to get supply from them. I think it then comes down to negotiation on every piece of legislation. That can be a good thing, that can be a bad thing. Is the Premier well placed to be a good negotiator? They've managed to get things through the upper house in testing times. They're going to have to put their best negotiating cap on. And I think the fact that the opposition, the coalition, have been so, I guess, antagonistic towards the crossbench could be a problem for them. So it could turn into better policy. It could mean that the government needs to start listening to other people. One of the greatest criticisms of the Premier internally is that it's his way or the highway.
Not enough listening.
No, it's not enough consultation. And it's not even consulting with Cabinet. It's that the Premier's office, and that's the way it goes. So perhaps it'll change the politics and perhaps the way the government, whoever is in charge, operates, because it might have to just actually listen to the will of the Parliament.
And final comment from you on federal implications. Everyone will be looking at the strength of both major parties' votes.
Yeah, I definitely think there are coalition MPs that lost or came close to losing. Victoria was once the jewel in the Liberal crown and it hasn't been trending that way. I think this will be used to test seats like Higgins, test seats like Kooyong, Goldstein, to see whether they think they can get it back at the next election or whether those seats are lost. And the Liberal Party do need to look to the outer suburban areas, which has been a really internal debate within the coalition, within the Liberal Party. So I think that will be interesting. Also, we haven't seen Peter Dutton down here, but also Anthony Albanese hasn't come down as much as perhaps thought at the start. He is a factional ally, and when he has come down, he hasn't necessarily been with the media too. So I think there's obviously a little bit of distance being put between those two at the moment as well.
OK, final predictions.
Labor minority government, I think. I think they'll lose up to 10 to 12 seats.
Okay.
But I think at the end of the day, the Labor will still be in power.
Yeah, I think there'll be a swing towards the coalition. I just think that 18 seat is too much for them to get over, and minority Labor government is probably the most likely outcome at this stage.
Well, we'll find out after people actually cast their votes. But a wonderful conversation with both of you. Thank you. Joining me tonight, Annika Smethurst and Richard Willingham. And Annika Smethurst is, of course, from The Age. Richard Willingham is from the ABC right here. Well, that's the program for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us on Victoria's election eve. You can watch the ABC's coverage of Victoria's election tomorrow with a special ABC News bulletin at 5:30 p.m. and on ABC TV ahead of election night coverage from 6 p.m. live on ABC Victoria or on iView. Have a terrific night.